To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. We've got a great show in store for you today, and some pretty tough subjects to cover here, too. At least this is going to make some people nervous, but you know what? That can actually be a good thing. We're going to talk about the insurrectionists next door, and in particular, how Idaho media is doing its level best to make you as concerned as possible about people who might be just a little too intent on standing up for their freedoms. Oh, I know, that's a terribly subversive kind of activity, but wait until you see the way that we're drawing some lines here to connect people who have done horrible, unspeakable things with your very neighbors and others who might just be a little bit concerned about what they see happening in terms of how the government is operating in their lives. Check out this headline. This is actually from the the Idaho Statesman. This was republished in the Times News or magicvalley.com. Idaho View, far-right groups who planned insurrection are commonplace in Idaho and close to power. Now, look, they're trying to springboard off the obvious drama that's been taking place in Washington, D.C. for these past few weeks with the January 6th committee. So there's lots of talk about the insurrection, the insurrection, the insurrection. Do you find it curious, like I do, that not a single person, none of the defendants that I'm aware of, have been charged with insurrection? They've been charged with trespassing. They've been charged with parading or otherwise being inside a federal facility or a government building where they did not have permission to be. But as far as insurrection, no, that's just kind of a scary word. And you'll see why as the Statesman tries to draw some lines connecting the people who took part in breaking into the U.S. Capitol and protesting the certification of the Electoral College votes on January 6th with the people who are just very much interested in maintaining their freedom and maintaining honest government. Let's dive into the story here. The editorial says, focusing on groups including the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and 3%ers who were involved in the 2021 attempted insurrection, the hearings presented compelling evidence of significant coordination between these groups as well as awareness within the Trump administration of their plans. Now, I have to point this out just because this just came out in the last week, and it's possible that the writers for the Idaho Statesman weren't aware of this, but a treasure trove of documents was leaked from the Department of Justice. And what they reveal is that a confidential human source, or CHS, working with the FBI, infiltrated the Kansas City Proud Boys, who were in fact there on January 6th, and was reporting back to his handlers at the FBI that these guys were in no way planning any kind of insurrection. In fact, what the informant described was most of the mob that actually went into the Capitol, there was very few people who actually broke in. That was a tiny minority, and of those who broke in, there's still a question as to how many of them may have actually been either federal agents or federal plants or informants. But of those who went into the Capitol, there were mostly people who were just there out of part of the herd mentality. The vast majority of the hundreds of thousands of people who were in Washington, D.C., and who were protesting the 2020 election and rallying in support of President Trump, they weren't violent. They didn't break in. They didn't do anything wrong. And in particular, the Proud Boys, as this confidential informant points out, were nonviolent. Yet they were still indicted. And they're still facing decades in prison as a result of this. The exculpatory evidence has been kept out of the public eye. It was kept away from the grand jury. You got to ask yourself, why would that be? Now, I think the obvious answer is because it doesn't fit the narrative that the Idaho Statesman, among others, are trying to push here. Now, as far as the Oath Keepers, yes, they were there as well. But again, when we talk about, they were coordinating and there was this evidence that the Trump administration knew what they were doing, the 3%ers, I can't speak to what their respective roles were. But I find it very curious that I haven't seen any video evidence of them standing up there and urging people to go into the Capitol, to break into the Capitol. But I did see a guy by the name of Ray Epps do that. And strangely, the federal government and the January 6th committee wants absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Epps. In fact, the New York Times actually wrote a sympathy piece earlier this week about how unfortunate it is that Mr. Epps was caught up in this conspiracy theory about him being a part of January 6th. Well, look, I only know what I saw and heard of him on video, his actual words from his own lips. And he was by far urging people to do things that they really shouldn't have done. Not so much these other groups. But let's see how we can draw the line to get us to fear our neighbors. Here we go. The Statesman says the danger of such violence around the country is high and has risen ever since Trump was elected. I assume they're talking about right-wing violence and not Black Lives Matter, not Antifa, not the anti-abortion activists, and what is it, Ruth Sent Us, or Jane's Revenge, or I don't even know what these groups are, but there's been a pretty fair amount of left-wing violence, but somehow that's really not our concern. It's the right-wing violence that concerns them ever since Trump was elected. And here we tie it into the danger in Idaho, including from many of the same groups who organized to attack the Capitol, is particularly acute. So are you panicking yet? Okay, well, if not, hang on, because they're going to double down and see if we can really get you worked up. As you may recall, Idaho was famously the home of the Aryan nations. Then we kicked them out. And my first reaction is, what's this we stuff, paleface? I mean, come on. Obviously, the communities in northern Idaho made it clear they did not want to be known as a haven for the Aryan nations. But it wasn't a matter of, well, official, we made official policies, and through state laws, we made it impossible for them to be here. The fact of the matter is, a lot of people just weren't ready to embrace their message, and it was never mainstream to begin with. But the idea here is the same soil that allowed them to take root has allowed a second resurgence of the far right in Idaho. Now, I have to ask, is this equating the far right with actual racists? Because there's a little bit of a problem here ideologically, if only from this standpoint. The far right, as I understand it, is very freedom-oriented. I mean, to the point where individual freedom is one of the tantamount tenets on which they stand. They do not like the idea of collectivism. Racism, on the other hand, is part and parcel of identity politics, which is collectivism at its ugliest, because it makes group judgments. It makes judgments of people based on what their skin color is, or what their ethnicity or their religion may be, as opposed to looking at them as an individual. Do you see the difference? One is a very collectivist ideology, that would be racism. The other one is very individual-based. So, maybe there's more here than meets the eye, but it seems like far right is supposed to be one of those trigger words to make us think in terms of, well, they must be Aryan nations if they're far right. Now, the Statesman goes on to say, this has been an obvious and escalating problem for years. And I have to ask, to whom? To the members of your editorial board? I'm sure it is. It's an obvious escalating problem. There are people pushing back against whatever left-wing agenda you may be pushing. But listen to the examples they give. Far right, there it is again, lawmakers inviting lunatics to give unhinged Islamophobic rants in the State House hearing rooms in 2016. I'm sure that in any given legislative session, you are going to hear rants as well as impassioned speeches, which could be classified as unhinged or lunatic, depending upon the stance of the person who's listening. I mean, for crying out loud, there's a legislator right now who is spending an awful lot of time talking about her period and about things that had no business being part of the public record. That's not unhinged? But okay. So it's far-right lawmakers inviting lunatics to come and give horrible speeches. Somehow, I think that's just a characterization and may not necessarily reflect the reality that, oh my gosh, they were asking actual racists to come in here and tell us why we should all be racist. Then, of course, the 3%ers are getting tarred and feathered here as well for badgering lawmakers while armed in the state capitol in 2018. Now, I don't know the specific incident that they're talking about, but I'm assuming that since Idaho is a state in which the right to keep and bear arms is still, for the most part, respected, were they doing something illegal? Is it possible to be peacefully armed? Now, before you answer that question, if you're of the mindset, well, no, any presence of a gun is the presence of violence, well, you better get around to disarming the state and its agents, because there are a lot of them that carry guns everywhere they go. And if you're going to maintain that, well, somehow their violence is righteous or it's preferable, why? I mean, show me your work. Why is state violence preferable if just merely having a firearm is considered, an act of violence? We need a little bit of consistency here. Now, showing up in the state capitol while armed does not necessarily mean that they were there intimidating people or threatening people. Now, they may have, the fact that they were armed may have made some people uncomfortable. But sometimes it's okay for public officials to be reminded that ultimately the people do retain freedoms that include the right to say no. And if need be, they can make that stick if those officials decide to push things in a violent direction. I mean, you can look at Canada, what they were doing to their citizens earlier this year over vaccine mandates for a good example of what that might look like. How about this one? Armed protests outside the homes of public officials throughout 2020 and 2021. Now, again, we're supposed to focus on the armed aspect of this. Oh, if they're armed, boy, they must have been there just to start violence and to threaten people. I want to ask the question, what were public officials doing throughout 2020 and 2021 that would encourage any kind of protest, armed or otherwise, outside their homes? Just for instance, were they denying people's rights to peaceably assemble, to worship, to open their businesses, to make a living, to visit with family members, to travel? Because if that's the case, then maybe people had every good reason and justification for protesting. And if you say, well, they shouldn't do it outside their homes, is there another way that they could do it? Clearly, they weren't welcome, to meet with these legislators or public officials, in their homes or in their offices. Again, I'm not saying that, boy, that's the only way to do it, but let's have a little context here. Were public officials doing something throughout 2020 and 2021? You know the answer to this. And the answer is yes. In the name of public health, they were taking people's rights and trampling on those rights and assuring us that they were doing it for our own safety. Only in hindsight, we learn none of it made a difference. It didn't slow the roll of the virus. It didn't stop the virus. It didn't make us safer. It just deprived people of mental health as well as an ability to make a living and to be able to live freely and make their own decisions. And that's wrong. I don't care how well-intended those officials were. It's still wrong. And then this one's kind of a stretch. Anti-lockdown protesters shattering a state capitol door in 2020. It's true that a door was broken, but do you understand the circumstances behind that door being broken? Public officials were trying to lock the public out of a meeting in which they were making decisions that drastically affected these people's lives. They were trying to keep them in the dark as to decisions that would drastically affect what they could and could not do. And there was a tussle over trying to keep a door open, and in that tussle, the door actually ended up being broken, which is unfortunate. But it never would have happened if this was taking place in the light of day instead of behind closed doors and, well, out of view of you peasants who really can't be trusted with these kinds of decisions. Moving on. Far-right extremism has attempted and sometimes made successful inroads into the halls of the Idaho legislature. And this is kind of the gist of why you need to fear the insurrectionists next door. So Representative Chad Christensen is the first one thrown under the bus here. Republican from Iona, still proudly lists his membership in the Oath Keepers, which Jason Van Tautenhove, who testified before the January 6th committee earlier this week, called a violent militia in his legislative biography. Now, Tautenhove is a former member of the Oath Keepers. He left them about 6 years ago. I don't know the circumstances behind his leaving, but it's clear that he's not on good terms with them and was doing his best to fill that role of telling, keeping the narrative alive of how evil they are and how racist they are and how violence prone they are. But in his estimation, he called them a violent militia. I am not aware of any acts of violence that Oath Keepers have engaged in. But because a former member, who may or may not have an axe to grind, called them a violent militia, yeah, the statesman's going to run with it. And then listen to these examples. Eric Parker, a leader of Idaho's 3%er militia, who's known nationally as the Bundy Ranch Sniper for aiming a rifle at federal law enforcement during Clive and Bundy's Bunkerville standoff, has twice sought legislative office. Todd Engel, another participant at Bunkerville, sought office this year. Now, thankfully, they say the GOP primary voters gave Christensen the boot this year, and neither of the other two succeeded in winning a majority, though Engel came uncomfortably close. I want to take a minute here and just fill in a couple of details on Eric Parker. And I'm doing this because I've actually had the chance to talk to him personally, and also I had a chance to hear his story as to why he was there at Bundy Ranch. Now, I mean no insult to anybody who thinks, well, what a terrible guy for pointing a rifle at these federal agents. But if that's all you know about him, if all you know is, well, I saw a picture of Eric lying on his belly with a rifle poking through the Jersey barrier on a freeway overpass back in April of 2014 in Bunkerville, Nevada, I can understand why you might have drawn a conclusion that he must be a really scary, dangerous guy. But I actually listened to an interview that he gave while he was still in prison awaiting trial. And most of those folks were held in prison for the better part of 2 years before they had a chance to go before the court. And he explained that the reason he was there at Bundy Ranch was because he had become aware of how out of control a particular federal agency, in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, had become under an extremely rogue agent by the name of Dan Love. Long story short, Dan Love had put together a militarized 200-man armed task force. Now, they were having training from LAPD SWAT. They had the FBI hostage rescue team there. This is before they ever started to try to round up or rustle the Bundy's cattle. But they had the place surrounded, surveilled. They had listening devices. They had video cameras. And were treating it as if, we are going to take down a terrorist cell somewhere in the heart of Fallujah, Iraq. Instead of a family of ranchers who the FBI had done threat assessments on at least twice, maybe 3 times, and every time those threat assessments came back with, this family is the lowest possible threat level, meaning if you back Cliven into a corner, you might get a punch in the nose. But the federal government assumed the worst, and so they sent people there with the admonition, we're going to kick their teeth in and show them who's boss. Now, Eric Parker and hundreds of other people heard about that and showed up to support the Bundy family. And Eric wasn't doing it out of a desire to go, get a chance to get some. He was doing it because he felt a Christian duty to stand up for people who were under threat from their government. In other words, his motivation, I think, was very solid. And in his trial, once the jury, I think there was at least 1, maybe 2 mistrials, but when the jury started to catch wind of just how out of line the federal government had been, both in its approach to taking the Bundy's cattle over an alleged debt. I mean, when's the last time you heard of a 200-man army being sent over an alleged debt? You owe this much in fines, versus, being there to protect the public from some kind of a dangerous threat. The jury wasn't going to convict. And so the federal government came back to Eric Parker and offered him a misdemeanor plea deal, which he wisely took. And it was simply, I think, interfering with the federal officer in the performance of his duties. And so Eric is a free man today. He still votes. He still owns his guns. And he has chosen to run for public office. And let me tell you why that impresses me, as well as for Todd Engel. If these guys were truly anti-government miscreants who were just bent on out there causing trouble and harming people, why would they work within the system? But see, they're held up as examples of, well, see, this is the kind of radicalism. And I'll grant you, what they both did by simply showing up and being prepared to defend people if necessary, that's something not a lot of people would do. But that's more an indictment of other people and the majority of people who would just sit back and, well, if the government's doing it, it must be the right thing to do, as opposed to someone who has a very clear sense of moral clarity and when it's right to stand up, particularly to stand up for other people. So the fact that he ran for office, both Eric and Todd, I think that's actually a good thing. And I had a chance to talk personally with Eric as he was campaigning, and he's not a hothead. He's not a person who is just out there shooting from the hip. He's actually a very thoughtful individual who's willing to sacrifice a lot and basically have skin in the game. But of course, he fits the stereotype that the Statesman wants to put forward of this is what you can expect. These are the insurrectionists. Oh, and by the way, neither Eric nor Todd were anywhere near the U.S. Capitol during the January 6th event. So I don't know why they want to try and tie him to it, but there you go. And then you have, of course, this instance. Still more members of the legislature have stood ready to offer support for their causes, as when Representatives Heather Scott, Sage Dixon, and Judy Boyle traveled to the 2016. Now, they call it a standoff. It really wasn't. It was an occupation. There were never guns pointed at each other. It was an occupation at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, staged by Ammon Bundy and assorted miscreants. Now, I think it's only fair that I point out that some of those assorted miscreants, in fact, a very large portion of those miscreants, were federal agents and federal informants who showed up to help steer whatever was going to happen there. Now, you can think whatever you want about Ammon Bundy, but I feel like it's worth pointing out. In the trial in Oregon, as well as the trial in Nevada, Ammon was, first of all, acquitted fully. He and the other 6 defendants in Oregon, everybody who went to trial was acquitted by the jury. What did the jury hear that made them decide not to convict? Maybe that's a question you should ask yourself. I don't think anybody on the editorial board of the Statesman is willing to ask that, but it's still a question that's worth asking. In the case of the federal government's actions in Bunkerville, I mean, I was right there in the courtroom. I got to cover that trial myself. And it was very clear that there was an incredible miscarriage of justice, so grievous that the judge herself said, the only remedy here is not a new trial, but to dismiss all the charges with prejudice, meaning they cannot be brought back. So think what you will about Ammon Bundy, but acquitted, charges dismissed. By the way, the Hammonds in Oregon, whom he was standing up for, pardoned by President Trump. Again, I know the hate is strong from a lot of people on the political left, but you can't really change the fact that they accomplished what they set out to do, which was to draw attention to government misconduct. And it came at a terrible price. And he suffered, along with many others, for doing so. So that's some backstory. Now, why am I qualified to speak on that? Because I have firsthand knowledge of it, as opposed to simply relying on whatever the press was telling me about it. But the Statesman says, with actions like these, it's no surprise to most people that most people in the Intermountain West expect further violence. And again, I'm going to ask, from whom? These guys or, the political left, Antifa, Black Lives Matter? A survey of the Intermountain West commissioned by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University last year found that 59% of Idahoans expect to see more political violence similar to what happened on January 6, 2021. It'd be interesting to know exactly why they expect to see that. And this one really must have shaken them to their bones. About 1 in 6 Idahoans said political violence is justified under certain circumstances. Well, I think that may actually be the case. Now, I'm just saying that primarily on the fact that we celebrated the 4th of July just a couple of weeks ago. What was that all about anyways? Oh, yeah. That was about political violence being justified when in the course of human events, it's necessary for people to throw off an oppressive government and take responsibility for governing themselves. I'm not saying that's where we are today, but I am saying it's an option. And it's the reason why we celebrate Independence Day. And it was because of government that was slipping beyond its intended purpose of protecting their God-given rights. So here's how they wrap this up. The Statesman says this is a situation that can't be allowed to persist, nationally or in Idaho. Idaho needs the same kind of work that led to the ouster of the Aryan nations, the kind of work that many in Idaho are already undertaking to reaffirm the commitment to settling our differences at the ballot box. So I have to ask, what exactly do you intend to do? I mean, how exactly do you think you're going to handle that? Is it just that we tar everybody who does not agree with whatever left-wing, imperative of the moment is on the table as somehow being in alignment with the Aryan nations? How's that working out for you? Because it seems like that's that push where everyone is so woke and everyone else who doesn't agree with me is evil and racist. It seems like the snapback on that could be pretty hard. Also, the idea that somehow, we just differences at the ballot box. Well, the main reason so many people showed up in Washington, D.C. on January 6th was because they were losing confidence that process by which we settle our disagreements at the ballot box could be trusted. And frankly, all the assurances, well, there's nothing to see here. You don't even need to question it. And that's happening not just on the national level, but it's happening even on the state levels. The powers that be are very, very reticent about having any questions. If truth was on their side, you would think that they would be fine with, look, let us just put it all on the table and show you why it's okay, why you can trust this. But they didn't. And it makes you wonder, if settling differences at the ballot box is in question, what other options do people have when government becomes unresponsive? And I understand that's a scary question. I want to share with you a quote here that I found in an article about why we have to protect our natural rights as well as our civil rights. This is from Alex Madagian. Americans understand we are born with rights, and it is the duty of government to preserve those rights. But as conservatives, we understand humans and human institutions cannot always be trusted. Yet, knowing human nature, we also know we can trust the government not to infringe our rights if we make the prospect of doing so too costly. Officials must know they can be held to account. Now, that can take a number of different forms. I mean, that could take a recall election. It could take removing them from office through elections. If they become particularly brutal in the way that they go about forcing the public to do their bidding, there are other options that I don't think anybody really wants to contemplate, but there's still an option. And I guess the point here is, don't be so quick to dismiss, people who found that line in the sand and were saying, I'm willing to stand up. And in the case of all the ones that they cited, none of them engaged in aggressive violence. They were standing up in defense of others who were on the receiving end of aggressive violence on the part of government. That is a huge distinction, in that the folks who stood up are the ones who are occupying the moral high ground, not the ones who are furthering the government, which, by the way, press members, I'm looking at you as to why that's a problem. In fact, I want to back this up with a quote here from Wayne Hoffman, president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, who was himself a journalist at one point. But he talks about why he left journalism, and he talks about how the era of Trump and COVID-19 turned the few remaining journalists into activists. These writers feel it's their job to defend government institutions and programs. And when a government-sanctified expert says something is true, reporters defend the official narrative by dismissing or openly mocking contrarian opinions as baseless or extremist, words that heretofore would never survive a first round of editing. And he's right. I'll actually give you a good example of what this looks like. Here's a local television journalist from Boise, and he's mocking a woman who was found guilty of, I think she was found guilty of parading, which is a fancy way of saying trespassing in the U.S. Capitol. This is a misdemeanor, and she has been sent to prison, federal prison, for 60 days. Pam Hemphill, she reported to prison earlier this week. And here's this TV reporter. Now, granted, this is on his personal account. This is not him doing a news story, but how small of a soul do you have to mock a 69-year-old cancer patient who's posted, look, I'm on the road heading to California's Dublin prison. I'm very frightened, but my strength is remembering Christ. Carry the cross for me, and I'm going to carry my cross for all January 6th prisoners. In God I trust. You don't have to agree with her, but would you sit there and mock a cancer patient, telling her, Pam, perhaps you should just go gently and quietly into that good night? You broke the law. You admitted to it. You said you're not blaming anyone but yourself. It's not cross-carrying. I mean, if this is representative of what the media and what journalism looks like these days, it's pretty hard to trust anything that you're being told, if that's the attitude that's being brought. And I agree with Wayne Hoffman. I think that activist mindset is very much the antithesis of actual journalism, which is to give us facts free of judgment and let us make up our own minds. So a couple quick thoughts on how to avoid media deception. First thing is, no matter what sources you're considering, no matter what subject or person you're hearing about, have the humility to ask yourself, how much do I know about this person or subject that wasn't told to me by someone else? As I mentioned before, with the Bundy Ranch situation or even the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, there's a lot of good information that I gained by being able to go to the source as opposed to simply follow media reports with their obvious narrative that they were trying to push. And it really made a difference. Secondly, you can ask, is it journalism or is it narrative? How can I tell the difference? Journalism will give you facts without a lot of emotion-laden, judgmental words. Narrative is about storytelling, and it's going to try to engage your emotions. You read a headline, or if you read a story that gets your emotions worked up, there's a very good chance what you're seeing is narrative. And that's someone else telling you what you should believe, as opposed to, here are the facts, you make up your own mind. It also helps to ask yourself, cui bono, which is, who benefits? Who benefits from the way that this story is being reported? I actually like Wayne's suggestion, which is just, you know what, turn off the legacy media. If something's important enough to you, it's worth researching for yourself. And if it's not important enough to research for yourself, maybe chances are it's really not that important to spend time worrying about. Most of our media today seems to be a fear delivery system. This editorial from the Idaho Statesman is a very good example of what that fear delivery system looks like. Fear your neighbor. Fear anyone who would stand up for freedom. Fear anyone who would dare resist what government is doing or tell you that you shouldn't go along with it without first asking permission. Well, the truth of the matter is no politician, no bureaucrat is ever going to give you permission to stand up and be a free individual. You have to make that decision for yourself. And the only way you can do that is to very clearly know who you are and what you stand for. I'm going to hearken to Henry David Thoreau. I think he had a very good take on this. I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest. That's a question each one of us gets to answer for ourselves. And I trust you to make that decision for yourself. But I would also urge you, before you make your mind up about the insurrectionists next door, take the time to talk to people, learn a little bit about their story, and you may find out that it's been widely blown out of proportion by a media that, for whatever reason, wants to keep you in a state of fear and in a mindset of subjugation. You're better than that. I'm better than that. So let's act like it. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not